Hello and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. Find a comfortable place. Let the sounds of the world outside fade away and allow your mind to drift back in time with me. Tonight, we're journeying to ancient Greece, a land of philosophers, heroes, and epic tales. We often imagine it through a romantic lens of sun-drenched marble temples and idyllic olive groves. But what if the most celebrated unions, the noble weddings that forged alliances and dynasties, were built not on a foundation of love, but of profound fear? Did you know that, for a young Greek noblewoman, the walk to the altar was often a journey into the unknown, a transfer of ownership from one master to another? Stay with me as we uncover the solemn truth behind the veil. And if you find our late-night journeys through the past soothing, consider subscribing to join our quiet corner of history. Let us begin by dispelling a modern myth. The ancient Greek concept of marriage, especially within the aristocratic echelons, had very little to do with romantic love as we understand it. It was not a partnership of equals born from affection. Instead, it was a transaction, a contract. Its primary purpose was twofold: to create a legitimate heir to inherit the family's property and name, and to strategically transfer wealth and forge powerful alliances between families or oika. The oikos, the household, was the fundamental unit of Greek society. Its preservation and prosperity were paramount. A wedding was the mechanism that ensured its continuation. For the men who arranged it, it was a matter of politics and economics. For the young woman at its center, it was the abrupt end of one life, and the beginning of another, one filled with uncertainty and duty. Love might, on rare occasions, blossom over time, but it was never the prerequisite. It was a fortunate accident, not the goal. At the heart of this transaction was the bride herself, though she was rarely an active participant in her own fate. A young woman in ancient Greece lived under the absolute authority of her kyrios, her male guardian. This was first her father, and in his absence, an uncle, an older brother, or even a grandfather. It was the kyrios who held her future in his hands. He alone had the legal right to give her away in marriage. She had no say in the matter. Her consent was not required, nor was it typically sought. Her value was measured in her lineage, her fertility, and the dowry she would bring. She was a vessel for continuing a bloodline, a political pawn in a game played exclusively by men. Her personal feelings, her hopes, her fears were largely irrelevant to the grander scheme of strengthening the family's position in the city-state. The choice of her husband was a calculation of power, not a matter of the heart. The dowry, or proie, was a critical component of the marriage negotiation. It was not a gift to the groom, but rather a portion of the bride's paternal estate allocated to her for the duration of the marriage. This property, which could include land, money, precious metals, and slaves, remained legally hers, but was administered by her new husband. Its purpose was to support her within her new home and to provide a safety net. Should the husband die or the marriage end in divorce, which was a right only the husband could easily exercise, the dowry had to be returned in full to her original family. This acted as a powerful incentive for the husband to treat his wife with a degree of respect and to not cast her aside frivolously. However, it also underscored her status. The dowry was a constant, tangible reminder that her position in the new oikos was conditional, a financial arrangement that could be dissolved, leaving her to be returned to her father's house like damaged goods. One of the most unsettling aspects of these unions was the significant age disparity. A noble girl was typically married shortly after she reached puberty, often as young as 14 or 15. Her husband, on the other hand, was likely to be a man in his 30s. He was a citizen, a soldier, a man established in the world, while she was a child, barely on the cusp of womanhood. This chasm in age and experience was intentional. It ensured the husband's dominance and the wife's malleability. She was seen as a blank slate, to be trained and molded by her husband into the perfect mistress of his household. He was not just her partner, but her teacher, her master, and the one who would initiate her into the physical realities of marriage, an experience for which she was likely completely unprepared. Imagine the fear of a young girl leaving the only home she had ever known to be bound to a man twice her age, a stranger she had likely never even spoken to before their betrothal. Before the wedding day itself, the bride-to-be would perform a series of poignant rituals that marked the end of her childhood. In the days leading up to the ceremony, she would gather the beloved toys of her youth, her dolls, her balls, her knuckle bones, and dedicate them to the gods, most often to Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt and protector of young girls. This act was a solemn farewell to the carefree world she was about to leave behind forever. It was a symbolic severing of ties with her girlhood, an acknowledgement that her days of play were over. From this point forward, her life would be defined by new duties: managing the household, weaving, and most importantly, bearing children. This quiet, personal ceremony, performed within the confines of her family home, was a moment of profound transition, tinged with the sorrow of letting go. On the eve of the wedding, or sometimes on the morning of, a crucial sacrifice was made. This was the protleia, a prenuptial offering made by the bride's father on her behalf. The sacrifice was typically made to goddesses who presided over marriage and childbirth, such as Hera, Aphrodite, and especially Artemis. By offering a sacrifice to Artemis, the family was symbolically asking the goddess to release the young girl from her protection as a virgin and allow her to transition safely into her new role as a wife. It was a plea for a smooth passage into womanhood, for fertility, and for protection during the perils of childbirth, which was a leading cause of death for women in the ancient world. This solemn rite was another reminder that the wedding was not just a social event, but a perilous journey for the bride, one that required divine intervention to navigate safely. The wedding day began not with celebration, but with a ritual of purification. The bride would take a ceremonial bath in water drawn from a sacred spring. In Athens, this water was carried from the Enikraunos spring by a young relative in a special vase called a lautrophoros. This bath, the lautra, symbolized her purification and separation from her past life. It was a cleansing ritual, preparing her for the physical and spiritual transition into marriage. As she was bathed and anointed with fragrant oils by her mother and female relatives, the atmosphere would have been one of quiet solemnity. She was then dressed in a special wedding garment, typically white or saffron-colored, and a delicate veil was placed over her face, shielding her from the world and marking her as something sacred, set apart, and ready for transfer. Following her preparations, a great wedding feast was held. But this feast did not take place at the groom's home or in a neutral location. It was held at the house of the bride's father. This was the final meal she would share with her family as a member of their oikos. The groom and his family would be present, but the event was centered on the bride's farewell. While there was food, wine, and music, an undercurrent of sorrow would have been palpable. The bride sat beside the groom, but remained veiled, a silent and mysterious figure at her own celebration. This feast was her formal, public departure. For her mother, her sisters, and the female slaves who had raised her, it was a moment of loss. They were saying goodbye to a child who, once she crossed the threshold of her new home, would belong to another family entirely. As dusk began to fall, the most dramatic part of the wedding began, the procession. This was not a gentle walk, but a symbolic abduction, a reenactment of ancient myths where gods and heroes seized their brides by force. The groom would grasp the bride by the wrist in a gesture of ownership, not affection, and lead her from her father's house. She would be placed in a chariot, flanked by the groom and his best man, the parachos. Her family and friends would follow behind, carrying torches and singing the nuptial hymn, the hymeneos. The flickering torchlight, the rhythmic chanting, and the movement through the darkening streets would have created a powerful, almost frightening spectacle. For the bride, this was the moment of no return. Pulled from her home by a near stranger, she was paraded through the city to her new, unknown life, a public display of her transfer from one master to another. Upon arriving at the groom's house, another series of powerful rituals took place at the threshold. The groom's mother would be waiting with a torch, welcoming the new bride into her domain. The couple might be showered with nuts and dried fruits, symbols of fertility and prosperity. The bride would be offered a piece of quince to eat, a fruit associated with Aphrodite, to ensure sweet speech and a fertile womb. Then the groom would lead or even carry her over the threshold. This was a critically important moment. By crossing into his house, she was legally and spiritually leaving her father's oikos and entering his. The door was then shut, sometimes symbolically barred by the groom's friends, signifying the finality of her separation from her old life. She was now, irrevocably, a part of a new family. Inside the home, away from the public procession, came one of the most anticipated moments, the anecalipteria, the ritual unveiling of the bride. In the presence of the wedding guests, the groom would lift his bride's veil. This was the first time he and many of the guests would see her face clearly. It was a moment of revelation and formal presentation. Following this, the groom would give her a gift, the anecalipterion, in acknowledgement of this unveiling. While it may seem romantic, it was also a moment of intense scrutiny. The bride, a young girl, was being formally inspected and accepted by her new family. Her value, her beauty, and her demeanor were all on display. It was the culmination of the public transfer, a final confirmation before the most private and intimidating part of the night began. After the unveiling and the presentation of gifts, the guests would depart, leaving the couple alone. The bride was then led by her new husband, and perhaps his mother, to the wedding chamber, the thalamos. A group of the couple's friends would often remain outside the door, singing epithalamia or wedding songs, intended to celebrate the union and ward off any evil spirits. Their loud, joyous singing was also a practical measure, meant to cover any sounds of distress from within the chamber. For the young bride, this was the moment of ultimate fear and submission. The consummation of the marriage was the legal seal on the contract. It was her duty, and there was no question of consent. This final act transformed her from a Parthenos, a virgin, into a gyne, a woman and a wife, completing the transfer of ownership in the most intimate way possible. On the morning after the wedding, the epolia took place. The doors to the couple's home were opened once more, and the bride's family would arrive bearing gifts. These presents were a formal acknowledgement of the successful consummation of the marriage. They were a sign that the union was now complete and accepted by both families. The bride, now a wife, would appear for the first time without her veil, signifying her new status. While this was a moment of celebration, it also served to solidify her new reality. The gifts were for her new household. Her family's visit was a final check, a confirmation that the contract had been fulfilled. From this day forward, her primary loyalty was no longer to them, but to her husband and his oikos. Her new life was one of confinement and duty. A respectable noblewoman's world was the gynaeceum, the women's quarters, typically located on the upper floor or the back of the house. This was her domain, but also her prison. She was expected to live a life of seclusion, rarely leaving the house except for religious festivals or family funerals, and even then, she would be veiled and chaperoned. Her primary responsibilities were to manage the household slaves, oversee the pantry and supplies, and spend her days at the loom, weaving cloth for the family. Her existence was defined by the walls of her new home. She was isolated from the public world of politics, art, and philosophy that her husband inhabited. Her social interactions were limited to female relatives and slaves. It was a quiet, constrained, and often lonely existence. Above all other duties, one reigned supreme: the production of a legitimate heir, preferably a son. This was the fundamental purpose of her existence in the new oikos. The pressure to conceive and to bear a healthy male child would have been immense. Her entire value as a wife was tied to her fertility. A barren wife could be easily divorced and sent back to her father's house in disgrace, the dowry returned. Every month that passed without a pregnancy would have been filled with anxiety. The birth of a daughter would be accepted, as she could one day be used for another strategic alliance, but only the birth of a son could truly secure the wife's position. He was the future of the Oikos, the one who would carry on the family name, inherit the property, and perform the sacred rites for the ancestors. The wife was merely the vessel to produce him. What happened if the marriage failed? The consequences were almost entirely borne by the wife. A husband could divorce his wife with relative ease, simply by having her sent back to her father's house in the presence of witnesses. He had to return the dowry, but otherwise he was free. A wife, however, could not initiate a divorce herself. She would have to persuade her father or male relatives to do so on her behalf, a difficult and scandalous process that was rarely undertaken. If a wife was caught in adultery, her husband was legally obligated to divorce her immediately. She would be shamed, barred from public religious festivals, and become a social outcast. The man she was with, however, would often face a lesser punishment. The double standard was absolute. The wife's fidelity was essential to ensure the legitimacy of the heir, while the husband's was a private matter. Her life was a tightrope walk of duty and obedience, where one misstep could lead to ruin. Of course, we must not paint with too broad a brush. It is possible, even probable, that genuine affection and companionship did develop in some marriages over time. We have tales, like that of Odysseus and the ever-faithful Penelope, that celebrate marital loyalty and love. But these are often presented as ideals, as exceptions to the norm. For every Penelope, there were countless anonymous women whose lives were dictated by contracts they did not sign. The very structure of the society, the legal framework, and the rituals of the wedding itself all point to a system designed around control, not affection. The symbolic abduction, the age gap, the seclusion in the gynaeceum. These were not the ingredients for a partnership of equals. They were the mechanisms for ensuring a young woman's complete submission to her husband and his family's interests. So, as we draw our journey to a close tonight, let us reflect on the veiled bride in the flickering torchlight. Was her heart filled with the flutterings of love or the cold grip of fear? For the vast majority of noblewomen in ancient Greece, the wedding was not the beginning of a fairy tale. It was a terrifying rite of passage. It was the moment she ceased to be her father's daughter and became her husband's property, a stranger in a strange house, with her entire future dependent on her ability to please a man she did not know and to produce a son. It was a union born of strategy, sealed by duty, and for the young woman at its center, very likely steeped in a profound and justifiable fear. Thank you for joining me here at the Sleepy Historian. I hope this story has given you something to ponder as you drift off. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, sleep well.